They burned his farm before the night could finish breathing, and by the time the last ember fell, Elias Boone was already gone. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your town in the comments. And if you believe justice doesn't always come with a gun, stay with me, because this one ride's quiet. The wind carried the smell first, dry timber and old hay turning to smoke under a sky that refused to look away. Elias stood 30 yards from what used to be his home, boots planted in the dust, hat low, eyes steady. He didn't move. Not when the first beam cracked. Not when the porch gave in. Not even when the townsfolk gathered behind him in a loose half-circle, whispering like they were watching weather roll in instead of a man losing everything he owned. Sheriff Dalton Price stepped forward slow, thumbs hooked in his belt. Voice calm like this was just another morning chore. Should have known better, he said. This land's got rules. Elias didn't answer. He just looked at the fire, then down at his hand. A small thing rested there. Leather. Worn. Darkened by time. A bracelet most men in that town would pretend not to recognize. But they did. That's why no one spoke. Somewhere behind him, a woman pulled her shawl tighter. A man spat into the dirt. No one stepped forward. No one asked questions. Because the story had already been decided hours ago, Elias Boone, the quiet rancher on the edge of town, had been helping Apache. And out here, that was enough. Dalton took a few steps closer, boots crunching on gravel, stopping just short of Elias's shadow. You got anything to say? He asked. The fire answered instead, a long sigh of collapsing wood. Elias lifted his eyes, just once. Not to Dalton. Not to the crowd. Past them. Out toward the open land where the horizon stretched flat and endless for miles. Then he spoke. Quiet. Barely above the wind. You done? It wasn't defiance. It wasn't fear. It was something else. Something that didn't belong to a man who had just lost his home. Dalton frowned, just a flicker. Then it passed. We're done, he said. You're not welcome here anymore. A few heads nodded behind him. Agreement came easy when no one had to carry it alone. Elias looked down again. At the bracelet. His thumb brushed over the stitching, slow, like he was remembering something no one else could see. Then he closed his hand around it. Tight. The fire burned lower. The night settled. And one by one, the townspeople drifted back toward their doors, their lamps, their safe little stories. By the time the last man turned his back, Elias Boone had already started walking. No horse. No supplies. Just boots in the dust, heading straight into the dark where the land stopped belonging to men like Dalton Price. The wind picked up behind him, carrying ash across the empty field, erasing what used to stand there. By dawn, there would be nothing left. And that was the part they understood. What they didn't understand was what that bracelet meant, what it called, and who would answer. The desert does not forgive a man who walks into it with nothing. But Elias Boone did not slow down. Not when the last light of town disappeared behind him. Not when the ground turned from packed dirt to loose sand that slipped under every step. Not even when the cold began to rise from the earth like something alive. He walked through the night with only the sound of his boots and the wind brushing past his coat, steady, measured, like he had done this before, like he knew exactly where he was going even if there was no trail to follow. The bracelet in his hand stayed closed tight, the leather warmed by his grip, the stitching pressing into his palm like a quiet reminder that he was not alone, not truly. Hours passed. The sky shifted from black to deep blue, stars fading one by one as the horizon softened. Somewhere far off, a coyote called, long and low, the kind of sound that made most men turn back if they had any sense left in them. Elias did not turn. He kept moving until the land began to change, the flat openness giving way to low ridges and scattered rock formations that broke the wind just enough to carry a different scent, sage and something older, something that did not belong to fences or towns or men who believed they owned either. He stopped there, just for a moment. His boots sank half an inch into the dust as he lifted his head, listening. Not for danger. Not for pursuit. For something else. Then slowly, he opened his hand. The bracelet rested against his skin, worn but unbroken, the small bead tied into its center catching the first thin line of dawn. He studied it the way a man studies a map he has already memorized. Then he did something the town would never have understood. He tied it around his wrist. Tight. The leather creaked softly as it settled into place, and for a second, nothing happened. The wind moved. The light grew. The world stayed exactly as it was. But Elias did not move. He stood there, shoulders squared, eyes forward, like he was waiting for an answer he already trusted would come. Time stretched. 1 minute. Maybe 2. The kind of silence that presses against your ears until you start to hear your own heartbeat louder than anything else. Then it changed. Not loud. Not sudden. Just a shift. A presence. Like the land itself had decided to breathe differently. Elias did not turn his head, but his eyes sharpened, his focus narrowing toward the ridge ahead where the rising sun painted everything in gold and shadow. A figure stood there, still as stone. Then another. And another. Shapes forming where there had been nothing a moment before, blending with the rock and the light until they stepped forward just enough to be seen. They did not rush. They did not speak. They simply watched. Elias took 1 step forward, then stopped. That was all it took. From the ridge, a woman began to walk down toward him, her movement steady, controlled, her presence cutting through the distance like something the land itself made space for. Her dark hair caught the early light, her eyes fixed on him long before she was close enough for words. Nayeli. She stopped 10 feet away, close enough to see the ash still clinging to his coat, close enough to see the bracelet now resting on his wrist. Her gaze dropped to it, then back to his face. No surprise. No confusion, only understanding. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved between them, carrying the last faint trace of smoke from a place miles behind. Then she asked, quiet and direct, "Who did this?" Elias held her gaze. His voice came out low, steady, carrying no anger, no plea, just truth. Men who thought silence meant weakness. Nayeli studied him for a long second, something shifting behind her eyes. Something older than anger, heavier than it. Then she turned her head slightly, just enough for the figures on the ridge to see her face. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "They burned the man who protected our blood," she said. The words moved across the distance like a signal. Not shouted, not forced. Answered. One by one, more figures stepped into the light, their silhouettes forming a line that stretched farther than Elias could count. Quiet, disciplined, waiting. Nayeli looked back at him. "Then we will make them remember," she said, not as a threat, not as a promise, but as something already decided. And in that moment, as the sun broke fully over the ridge, Elias Boone was no longer a man who had lost everything. He was a man who had been answered. The sun had barely cleared the ridge when the line began to move, not fast, not loud, just a quiet shift that rolled across the land like wine through tall grass. And Elias Boone stood still long enough to understand what that silence meant. This was not anger. This was purpose, the kind that did not rush because it did not need to prove anything. Nayeli walked ahead of him, her pace steady, eyes forward, and behind her the warriors followed in formation, so precise it felt less like men and more like the land itself deciding to walk. Each step measured, each shadow stretching long across the desert floor as the morning light grew stronger. Elias mounted the horse one of them had brought without a word, the leather saddle worn but cared for, the reins placed in his hand like they already belonged there. And for the first time since the fire, he allowed himself to look back. The horizon behind them was empty now, no smoke visible from this distance, no sign that anything had been taken from him. And that was the part that settled something deep in his chest, because what was gone did not matter anymore, only what came next. The ride took hours, but it felt shorter, carried by the rhythm of hooves against dry ground, a low, steady percussion that matched the pulse in his veins. And as they moved closer to the edge of town, the land began to change again, fences appearing first, then broken posts, then the faint outline of buildings rising out of the heat like something unsure of itself. Nayeli slowed before the first marker, a weathered sign leaning to one side, the name of the town barely visible under years of dust and sun. She raised her hand slightly, and the entire line behind her came to a stop at once. No confusion, no delay, just stillness returning as if it had never left. Elias brought his horse alongside her, close enough to hear her breathe, close enough to see the way her gaze rested on the town ahead, not with hatred, not with fear, but with recognition, as if she had seen places like this many times before and already knew how they would respond. "They will be watching," she said quietly. Elias nodded once. "They always are. Down below, The town had begun to stir, not with the slow ease of a normal morning, but with something sharper, doors opening just enough for eyes to look out, movement behind windows, a horse shifting nervously near the hitching post as if it could feel what was coming before the men did. Sheriff Dalton Price stepped out onto the main street, hat already on, hand resting near his belt, posture stiff in a way that tried to look confident but did not quite hold. He saw them. Even from this distance, Elias could tell by the way Dalton stopped walking, by the way his shoulders tightened just a fraction too much. One man became a few. A few became a crowd. Not large, not loud, but enough to fill the space between buildings with tension that had no place to go. Nayeli did not move. She let them look. She let them count. One rider. Then 5. Then 20. Then more than any of them could keep track of. Elias watched the understanding spread slowly across their faces, not all at once, but piece by piece, like a truth they did not want but could not deny. He could feel the weight of it in the air, the same way he had felt the fire the night before, except this time it was colder, heavier, pressing down instead of rising up. This is where men usually speak, Elias said under his breath. Nayeli glanced at him, just briefly. Only if they are unsure, she replied. He almost smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. Down in the street, Dalton took a step forward, then stopped again, his voice carrying just enough to reach the ridge. You made your point, he called out. You can turn back now. No one answered. The wind moved through the space between them, lifting dust into thin spirals that caught the light and disappeared just as quickly. Elias shifted slightly in the saddle, not to draw attention, not to threaten, just enough to let Dalton see his face clearly. Recognition hit harder than anything else. Not because Elias had returned, but because he had not returned alone. The silence stretched. Seconds felt longer than they should. Somewhere behind Dalton, a door creaked open, then closed again, like the town itself was unsure whether to hide or watch. Nayeli finally took one step forward, her horse moving with her, and the line behind her followed in perfect echo, not advancing, not yet, just reminding the ground beneath them that they were there. We did not come for your fear, she said, her voice calm, carrying across the distance without force. We came for the truth. And in that moment, something in the town shifted, not outward, not visible, but real enough that Elias could feel it, because for the first time since the fire, the men who had watched in silence the night before were no longer certain they understood what they were standing on. The word hung in the air longer than it should have. Truth, simple, quiet, but heavy enough to press against every man standing in that street. And Sheriff Dalton Price shifted his weight just enough to betray that he understood exactly what it meant, even if he was not ready to answer it. The wind moved again, brushing past coats, lifting dust along the edges of the buildings, carrying the faint scent of old ash that had not fully settled since the night before. Elias Boone sat still in the saddle, his posture relaxed in a way that did not invite challenge, his eyes steady on the man who had watched his home disappear without a single question. No one reached for anything. No one stepped forward. The town held itself in place, caught between what it had done and what it might have to admit. Dalton cleared his throat, the sound small against the open space, but sharp enough to break the stillness. You are making this bigger than it needs to be, he said, his voice measured, controlled, like he was trying to pull the moment back into something he could manage. A misunderstanding does not require an army. Nayeli did not respond right away. She let the silence return, let it settle around his words until they sounded thinner than when he first spoke them. Then she looked past him, not at the sheriff, but at the people behind him, the ones who had stood in the firelight and said nothing, the ones who had decided without knowing. A misunderstanding, she repeated softly, and there was no anger in her voice, only a quiet clarity that made the phrase feel fragile. She took another step forward, just enough for the morning light to fall fully across her face. Just enough for every eye in that town to see her clearly, not as a shadow, not as a rumor, but as a person standing where she had every right to stand. Then let us understand it, she said. The words did not rise. They did not push. They simply arrived, steady and complete. A murmur moved through the crowd, low and uncertain, like a thought no one wanted to claim out loud. Elias watched it happen, the way doubts spread slower than fear but deeper, the way a single question could unsettle a certainty that had felt solid just hours before. Dalton's jaw tightened, just slightly. "There is nothing to understand," he replied. "He broke the rules. We enforced them." Elias tilted his head, just a fraction, the smallest movement, but enough to draw attention without asking for it. "You never asked what the rule was for," he said, his voice calm, carrying across the space without effort. A few faces shifted. A man near the edge of the street looked down at his boots. A woman in the doorway pressed her hand against the frame as if steadying herself. Dalton took a step forward this time, more deliberate, closing the distance by a yard, trying to reclaim ground that was no longer his to define. "The rule is simple," he said. "You do not bring trouble into this town." Nayeli's gaze returned to him, direct, unwavering. "And who decides what trouble looks like?" she asked. The question landed differently. It did not accuse. It did not demand. It opened something. For a moment, Dalton did not answer. The pause stretched just long enough for it to be noticed, just long enough for the people behind him to feel it. Elias watched the shift again, subtle but real, the way certainty began to loosen its grip when it was asked to explain itself. The sun climbed higher, light filling the spaces between buildings, softening the edges of everything that had seemed so sharp in the early morning. Nayeli reached up slowly, her fingers brushing the leather at her wrist, the same pattern Elias now wore, the same quiet symbol that had gone unseen by the town until now. She lifted her hand slightly, not as a signal, not as a command, but as a reminder. "He did not bring trouble," she said. "He carried protection." The words settled into the space like something that had always been there, waiting to be spoken. Elias did not move. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the town, on the faces that were beginning to change, not all at once, not completely, but enough to matter. Dalton exhaled slowly, his composure holding, but thinner now, less certain than before. "Protection for who?" he asked. Nayeli held his gaze. "For someone your town chose not to see," she said. And just like that, the silence returned again, deeper this time, heavier, because now it was not empty. It was filled with the beginning of something the town could no longer avoid. The words did not fade, they settled, and once they settled, they refused to move, like dust after a long drought, clinging to everything it touched, and the town felt it, not in their ears, but in the space behind their ribs where certainty used to sit. Elias Boone watched it happen the way a man watches a storm roll in, not surprised, not hurried, just aware that once it begins, there is no stopping what comes next. Sheriff Dalton Price shifted again, slower this time, more careful, like each movement had to be measured now that eyes were no longer fully on his side. He glanced behind him, just once, quick enough to seem like nothing, but long enough to notice that the faces standing there were no longer looking at Elias the same way they had. The night before, that was all it took. A crack, small, invisible to anyone not paying attention, but real. "You speak like you know something we do not," Dalton said, his voice steady, but carrying less weight than before. Nayeli did not answer him directly. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the edge of the street, toward a narrow space between two buildings where the shadows still held the cool of early morning. "Come forward," she said, not loud, not commanding, but certain. For a moment, nothing happened. The kind of silence that makes a man think he imagined the words. Then a movement. Slow. Hesitant. A figure stepped out from the shade, small, wrapped in a worn shawl that did not belong to the town, her steps careful, as if the ground itself might reject her if she moved too quickly. Elias recognized her before she lifted her head. He did not turn. He did not react. He simply watched. The town noticed her all at once, not because she made a sound, but because she had been unseen for too long, and now she was standing where she could not be ignored. A few murmurs rose, uncertain, questioning, like people trying to place a memory they had chosen not to keep. Dalton's eyes narrowed. "Who is that?" he asked, though something in his voice suggested he already knew the answer would not help him. Nayeli spoke before anyone else could. "The one he protected," she said. The woman lifted her face then, slowly, and the light found her features, tired but steady, marked not by weakness, but by distance, by time spent moving through places that did not welcome her. "I came through your town 3 nights ago," she said, her voice quiet, but clear enough to carry. "I asked for water. No one spoke. No one stepped forward to claim the memory. Elias felt the shift deepen. Not louder, not faster, just heavier. The woman continued, her hands still, her posture firm in a way that did not ask permission. No one answered, she said. Except him. She nodded slightly toward Elias, just enough for the connection to settle into place where it could not be undone. He gave me water. He gave me a place to rest. And before sunrise, he told me to leave. A man near the back shifted his weight. Another looked toward the ground. Dalton's jaw tightened again, but this time it did not hold as steady. And that makes him innocent, he asked. That makes him right. Nayeli's gaze returned to him, calm, unwavering. It makes him human, she said. The words did not strike. They did not push. They simply stood there, undeniable. Elias exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing not because the moment had passed, but because it had arrived exactly where it needed to. He looked at Dalton, really looked this time, not with anger, not with accusation, but with something far more difficult to carry. Understanding. You never asked who I helped, Elias said quietly. You only decided why. Dalton opened his mouth, then stopped. The words did not come as easily now. Behind him, the town stood in a silence that no longer belonged to fear, but to something far more uncomfortable. Recognition. The sun climbed higher, light filling every corner of the street, leaving no place for shadows to hide what had been ignored. Nayeli stepped forward again, just one pace, and the line behind her echoed the movement without sound, without force, just presence. You called it trouble, she said. But what you feared was a man who chose to see what you refused. And this time, no one answered, because there was nothing left to say that could return things to what they had been. Silence did not leave the street. It deepened, and when silence deepens, it changes shape. It becomes something a man cannot step around or speak over, and Sheriff Dalton Price felt it settling in places he could not control. He stood there with the weight of every I no longer behind him, but on him, measuring, questioning, waiting for something he had never needed to give before. Elias Boone watched without moving, his hands resting easy, his shoulders relaxed, not because the moment was light, but because it had already tipped. The woman who had stepped forward lowered her gaze slightly, not in fear, but in completion, like she had said what needed saying and nothing more belonged to her. Nayeli remained still, her presence steady as the line behind her held the ridge without a single shift, without a single break in formation, and that stillness carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. Dalton drew a slow breath, the kind a man takes when he realizes the ground beneath him is no longer his to stand on. You expect this town to answer for one night? He asked, his voice tighter now, less certain, the words chosen carefully but landing heavier than he intended. Elias tilted his head slightly, not in challenge, not in judgment, just enough to let the question settle before answering. No, he said. I expect it to remember. The difference between the two sat in the air like something that could not be ignored. A man near the saloon shifted his stance, boots scraping lightly against the dirt, the sound louder than it should have been in the quiet. Another man removed his hat, not as a gesture, not fully, just enough to break the line of pride he had been holding since morning. These were small things. But out here, small things were where truth began to show itself. Dalton noticed it. That was the problem. He saw the shift, felt it slipping through his fingers, and for the first time, he did not look at Elias or Nayeli. He looked at his own town. You all saw what happened, he said, turning halfway, his voice reaching back toward the people behind him. You stood there. You agreed. No one answered. Not because they had nothing to say, but because agreement spoken in a crowd feels different when it is called out alone. The silence answered for them. Elias watched Dalton carefully now, not with interest, but with a quiet understanding of what came next. Men like Dalton did not lose loudly. They unraveled slowly, one realization at a time. Nayeli took a small step forward again, her boots pressing into the dirt with a soft, deliberate sound, and the line behind her did not move this time, because it did not need to. You are not being asked to answer for a night, she said calmly. You are being asked to see what that night revealed. Dalton turned back toward her, his jaw set, but his eyes no longer steady. And what is that? He asked. Nayeli did not hesitate. That you chose fear over truth, she said. The words did not rise. They did not accuse. They simply placed themselves where they could not be denied. The woman in the shawl shifted slightly, her hands tightening around the fabric as if bracing against something that had already passed. Elias glanced at her briefly, then back to Dalton, his expression unchanged, but something in his eyes had softened, not toward Dalton, but toward the moment itself, because this was no longer about what had been taken, it was about what could still be understood. A boy, no older than 12, stepped forward from behind one of the buildings, his face uncertain, his eyes moving between Elias and the woman in the shawl. "I saw her," he said suddenly, his voice small but clear in the stillness. Heads turned. The sound broke something open. "She was at the well," he continued, his words gaining steadiness as he spoke. "No one helped her." "He did." The boy pointed toward Elias, not accusing, not defending, just stating what he had seen. Dalton's shoulders tightened again, but this time it was not anger that held them. It was the weight of something slipping beyond his reach. Nayeli watched the boy for a moment, then nodded once, not as approval, but as acknowledgement. "Truth does not need many voices," she said quietly. "Only one that is willing to stand." Elias exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but enough to mark the moment as it settled into place. Dalton looked around again, slower this time, taking in faces that no longer mirrored his certainty, and for the first time, he had no words ready. The wind moved through the street, carrying dust in thin lines across the ground, erasing nothing, but reminding everyone that what had been done could not be undone, only understood. And in that understanding, something had already changed. The boy's words did not echo, they settled, and when they settled, they did something far more dangerous than noise ever could. They made room for memory, and memory does not ask permission when it returns. Elias Boone saw it first in the way a man near the hitching post lifted his eyes, slow, uncertain, like he was seeing the night before from a different place, not as part of a crowd, but as himself. Then another. Then a woman at the doorway who had wrapped her shawl tight suddenly loosened her grip, her fingers trembling not from fear, but from recognition. Sheriff Dalton Price felt it slipping now, not in a single moment, but in pieces, like dry earth giving way under steady pressure, and he knew, even if he would never say it, that this was the part no badge could hold together. He drew in a breath, deeper this time, and stepped forward again, but the step did not carry the same weight it had before. "You are turning them against their own," he said, his voice sharper now, reaching for control that no longer answered him. Elias did not move. "No," he replied quietly. "I am letting them stand where they should have stood." The difference hung there, undeniable. Nayeli watched Dalton for a long second, her expression unchanged, but something in her gaze had shifted, not toward anger, not toward triumph, but toward something heavier, something that understood what it meant for a man to lose the ground he built himself on. "This is not about against," she said. "It is about within." Dalton's jaw tightened, his hand brushing lightly against his belt, not reaching, not threatening, just a habit of a man who had always believed he had something to hold on to. "You came here with 200 riders," he said. "Do not speak like this is quiet." Nayeli did not look at the line behind her. She did not need to. "They are not here to take," she said. "They are here to witness." The words settled deeper than the last. Witness. It changed the shape of everything. A crowd can act without thinking, but a crowd being watched remembers itself. Elias felt it in the air, the way the tension no longer pushed outward, but inward, turning back on the men who had stood so easily in agreement before. The boy who had spoken stepped back now, not in fear, but in the awareness that what he had said could not be taken back, and yet he did not lower his eyes. That mattered. A man near him placed a hand on his shoulder, not to pull him away, but to steady him. Small things. Again, always small things first. Dalton saw it all. That was the problem. He saw the boy. He saw the man. He saw the way the crowd no longer moved as one. And for the first time, his voice did not come quickly. "So what do you want?" he asked, and this time, the question did not carry authority. It carried something else. Nayeli stepped forward one more pace, close enough now that the distance between ridge and street no longer felt like a barrier, but a bridge. "Nothing that is not already yours to give," she said. Dalton frowned, the answer not landing where he expected. "Speak plainly," he replied. Nayeli held his gaze. "Say it was wrong," she said. No force. No demand. Just a line drawn where it had always needed to be. The town felt it. Elias did not look at Dalton now. He looked at the people behind him, at the faces that had watched the fire, at the ones that had stayed silent, and he saw something there that had not been there before. Not courage. Not yet. But the beginning of it. Dalton exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just enough to show the weight he had been carrying alone without realizing it. He glanced back once more, and this time, the town did not look back at him the same way. They were not waiting anymore. They were watching. The difference was quiet, but it was complete. He turned forward again, facing Elias, facing Nayeli, facing the line that had not moved but had changed everything simply by being there. The wind passed through again, softer now, carrying no smoke, no ash, just the dry breath of open land that had seen men come and go long before any of them claimed it. Dalton opened his mouth, and for a moment, nothing came out. Because this time, the words were not something he could choose lightly. This time, they would stay. The silence did not break, it leaned forward, and in that leaning, every man in the street felt the weight of what was about to be said, not because it was loud, but because it could not be taken back once it was spoken. Sheriff Dalton Price stood with his mouth slightly open, breath caught somewhere between pride and something far more difficult to carry. And for the first time since the morning began, he looked smaller, not in body, but in certainty. Elias Boone watched him without pressure, without expectation, just present, like a man who had already let go of needing anything from the outcome. Nayeli did not move. She did not repeat herself. She did not push the moment forward. She let it stand, because truth, when it arrives, does not need to be chased. The wind passed through the street again, slower now, lifting a thin layer of dust that drifted across boots and boards and settled again like a quiet reminder that time does not wait for a man to decide who he is. Dalton swallowed once, his jaw tightening, then loosening, then tightening again, the kind of movement that comes when a man is not fighting another person, but himself. Behind him, the town did not speak. They did not shift. They simply watched, and that watching carried more weight than any shout ever could. A man coughed softly. A door creaked. Small sounds, but they no longer filled the space. The space belonged to Dalton now. He looked at Elias, then at Nayeli, then back at the people who had followed him without question the night before, and something in his eyes changed, not fully, not cleanly, but enough to be seen. He began, then stopped. The word did not hold. He tried again, slower this time. It was handled wrong. The sentence landed, but it did not settle. It hovered, incomplete, like a door left half open. Nayeli's gaze did not soften. It did not harden either. It simply remained. Say it, she said quietly. Not louder, not stronger, just clearer. Dalton closed his eyes for a brief moment, no longer than a breath, and when he opened them again, he was not looking at Elias, not looking at Nayeli, but at the ground between them, as if the truth might be easier to place there than in the eyes of the people who would hear it. It was wrong, he said. This time, the words did not hesitate. They did not bend. They fell clean. And when they did, the air shifted. Not dramatically, not with relief, but with something steadier, something that felt like a line finally drawn where it should have been from the beginning. Elias exhaled slowly, the tension he had carried since the night before easing, not because something had been returned to him, but because something had been set right in a way that could not be undone. He did not nod. He did not speak. He simply let the moment stand. The town felt it too. A woman lowered her head. The man near the hitching post removed his hat completely this time, holding it against his chest without realizing he had done it. The boy who had spoken earlier stood a little straighter, not because he had been told to, but because something inside him had settled into place. Nayeli finally moved again, just a small step back, creating space instead of taking it, and the line behind her remained still, because there was no need to move forward anymore. Then you understand, she said. Dalton did not answer. He did not need to. Understanding had already shown itself in the only way that mattered. The wind passed through once more, softer now, carrying nothing but the quiet of a morning that had become something else entirely. Elias shifted in the saddle slightly, his hand brushing against the leather bracelet at his wrist, feeling its presence, its weight, its meaning, and for the first time since he had tied it there, he loosened his grip on it, just enough to let it rest instead of holding it. He looked at Naeli, just briefly, and in that glance, there was no debt, no claim, only recognition. She met his eyes, the same understanding reflected back, then turned her gaze toward the town one last time. "Remember it," she said, not as a warning, not as a command, as something that would remain long after they were gone. And in the quiet that followed, no one doubted that they would. No one moved at first, and that was how Elias Boone knew it was over, not with a shout, not with a command, but with stillness that no longer needed to hold anything together. The street remained quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now, not the kind that hides behind fear, but the kind that stays after something has been understood. Elias shifted his weight slightly in the saddle, the leather creaking softly beneath him, a small sound that seemed louder now that nothing else competed with it. He looked once more at the town, at the faces that had watched his home turn to ash, and he saw something there he had not seen before, not apology, not fully, but the beginning of it, the part that comes before a man knows how to say it out loud. That was enough. He turned his horse. The movement was slow, deliberate, without drama, and the line behind him did not move until Naeli did. She waited just a moment longer, her eyes resting on the people who stood there, not judging, not forgiving, simply seeing them as they were now, changed in a way that could not be undone. Then she turned as well. The first step away was the heaviest. After that, it became easier. The sound of hooves returned, low and steady, moving away from the town instead of toward it, carrying with it the presence that had filled the street just minutes before. No one followed. No one called out. The town watched them go, and this time, they did not look away. Elias did not look back again. He did not need to. The land opened in front of him the same way it always had, wide, patient, untouched by what men chose to believe about it. The wind met him halfway, brushing past his coat, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant sage, clean, unburdened. He reached down once, his fingers adjusting the bracelet at his wrist, not tightening it, not holding it, just letting it sit where it belonged. Beside him, Naeli rode in silence, her posture steady, her gaze forward, as if this road had always been waiting for them both to walk it. Behind them, the line of riders stretched long across the rising light, no longer a force, no longer a warning, just a presence returning to where it came from. Back in the town, Sheriff Dalton Price remained where he stood, his hands at his sides, his shoulders lower than they had been that morning. The people around him did not move toward him now. They did not wait for him to speak. One by one, they turned away, not in defiance, not in rejection, but in something quieter, something that asked each of them to carry their own part of what had happened. The boy who had spoken earlier lingered for a moment, looking out toward the ridge where the riders had already begun to disappear into the light. Then he turned as well, his steps slow but certain. The woman in the shawl stood last. She looked at the place where Elias had been, then at the town behind her, and without a word, she walked on, not hurried, not afraid, just moving forward. The street emptied the way it always did, but it did not feel the same. Something had stayed behind, not in the buildings, not in the ground, in the way the people carried themselves as they returned to their doors. The wind moved through once more, soft, steady, passing over the place where everything had happened and leaving nothing visible, nothing to point at, nothing to prove. And yet, everything had changed. Out beyond the ridge, where the land stretched farther than any fence could claim, Elias Boone rode on without looking back, and the sun climbed higher behind him, casting a long shadow that slowly faded into the open ground. Out here, justice did not need a voice. It did not need a hand raised or a weapon drawn. It only needed a man who chose to stand, and a moment when others finally chose to see.